Good morning. My name's Ryan Reuter, and I'm a professor at Oklahoma State University. It's good to be with you this morning on this webinar, and I'm going to present a little bit of research that we've done that's using the Super Smart Feed device from CLOC. And so I think if you're on this webinar, you're probably familiar with CLOC and familiar with maybe even this piece of equipment. But I wanted to share with you a little bit of research that we did. So first thing I'd like to do is acknowledge my co-authors. Taylor Hoos is a former graduate student of mine, and this is her thesis project. I think she's listening in. She's working on a PhD right now, doing precision animal feeding stuff too. So she's kind of continuing some of this work. And Dr. Carla Goad is a statistician here at OSU and was our experimental design consultant. And on this project, you'll see, I think we certainly needed her help on this project. So let's get into it. I presented this information at the national meeting of the National Argentinian Congress of Animal Production in Bahia Blanca, Argentina in October. I was invited to go down there. That was a lot of fun. And it was really interesting to me that researchers there and all over the world are quite interested in these topics. I think maybe just as much as we are here in the States. A lot of interest in precision animal management and precision feeding. So like I said, if you're on this call, you're probably aware that this precision animal management space is taking off, and there's new technology that has been and is continuously being developed that allows us to precisely and automatically provide supplements to individual cattle on a daily basis. And I think this is obviously exciting for me and several of us because it opens up all kinds of new questions that we can ask about managing supplementation and lots of new ways that we can conduct supplementation research. So if you're not familiar with this equipment, let me briefly explain how it works and kind of what the approach is. This feeder is called a Super Smart Feed. It's manufactured by CLOC in South Dakota. This feeder has approximately a 2,000 kilogram feed bin, so pretty large capacity, and it has 4 feeding stations. You can kind of see there's two stations on the front, 2 stations on the back, and they each have those alleyway panels that lead up to them. And so that's kind of what this system looks like. This is what the feeding trays look like from the animal's perspective. When an animal comes up to the feeder, the feeder is basically going to read its RFID tag and dispense supplement with a drag chain into that stainless steel feeding tray. And it dispenses feed relatively slowly to try to make sure that animals have time to consume the supplement. I think that's part of the work that CLOC is doing to try to time the dispense rate with the feeding rate of the animals and stuff like that. But basically, it dispenses supplement for each animal. And when an animal reaches its limit for the day, however that's been assigned, then the feeder will no longer dispense any feed for that animal. So it's controlling feed delivery to individual animals on a daily basis. So that's kind of what that system looks like. This animal's wearing a GPS collar that we made and was doing some other research with, but basically this system operates off a normal $2.50 RFID tag, passive RFID tag. So obviously the feeder's on wheels, which makes it really portable. The stalls that you see there kind of fold up when you have it in transportation mode. It's got the lids open up on the top of the feed bin so you can load the feed from an overhead bin or an auger or something like that. This feeder is self-contained. It's solar powered. It's connected to the internet via cell phone signal, so it's really convenient to use in remote areas and in pastures, which is the space that I'm interested in working in. So it makes it really nice to be able to use in pastures. And CLOC provides a website interface to access the feeder settings and data remotely. And this is an example of what that feeder interface might look like, or what it does look like. I'm not sure exactly how many of these units CLOC has produced at this point, but I know that there already are some around the world. This is a picture from Uruguay at a research station in Uruguay, where a good friend of mine and colleague, Dr. Alejandro Lamana, is doing similar precision animal feeding research. This is one of his grad students there working on this project. So it's just kind of an example of the interest worldwide in this space of precision animal feeding. So as you might imagine, most producers or many producers are pretty excited about this technology. When you talk to them about it, or when they see it, they're pretty excited about it. But really, as with most technology, most new things, researchers are kind of the early adopters. The first question that people have when they see this feeder, or when I talk about this feeder somewhere, is the first question they ask is, what does it cost? And Kurt at CLOC's probably on the call, and I'm going to let him certainly answer all those questions. But the second question that people have, and the second question that I had, is, how many cattle will it handle? And you know, I think that's coming from, we know that it's expensive, relatively expensive, the equipment is. And so the question is, how far can you spread that overhead cost? How many animals can you spread that overhead cost over to get the cost per head per day down, and make it cost effective to use it? So that's part of that. That's what's stimulating that question, I think, from a lot of people. And then, of course, you know, the cost effectiveness, you can get all kinds of a big discussion there about different things about what does labor cost, and how much more efficient can we be with precision supplementation rather than traditional supplementation. So there's lots of factors, but I think what stimulates most of the question is how many animals can we put with this feeder so that we can get the overhead costs of the feeder down. And I felt like that was my question, and a lot of people's questions, and I felt like that was a research question, certainly, that I was interested to try to answer and would try to answer. So that's what stimulated this research project. Basically, when you think about how many cattle can you put with this feeder, you kind of have to start thinking that this approach to supplementing cattle is pretty different than our traditional approach. This feeder only has 4 feeding stations, so only 4 cattle at a time can use the feeder. Cattle have to come to the feeder and wait in line to consume their supplement every day. And so that's really different from our normal way of supplementing cattle, where we basically go into a pasture, and how many ever cattle are in that pasture, from 10 to 200. We have a trough, and we pour feed out. Basically, all the cattle in the pasture come eat at the same time, line up and eat at the same time. For us, if we'll feed about 1 kilogram of supplement per cow in that traditional system, all those, that supplement will be completely consumed in 10 minutes. And so, that sort of behavior is pretty different than expecting cows to use this feeder, where they're only 4 at a time can use it, and they're going to have to wait in line to be able to use it. So I think there's a real interesting question here about how many cattle this can service, and essentially we're asking, the way that I'm phrasing the question is, what is the effect of competition for a feeding space at this feeder? What effect does that have on a variable that we're interested in about cattle performance or behavior, right? So that's kind of where we come to from the competition. So the objective of our study was to determine the effective competition for a feeding space at an automated supplement feeder, and specifically we're interested in supplement intake and time spent near the feeder. And the reason we were interested mostly in time spent near the feeder is I thought that was a decent proxy for how this feeding approach might affect grazing behavior. I basically wanted to know, are animals hanging out around the feeder and waiting for supplement rather than being out in the pasture and grazing? So that was kind of the two main variables that we were curious, how does competition affect those variables? So we'll get into the methods for this study. Basically, it was kind of an unconventional setup. I had one super smart feed that I could work with, and so I was trying to figure out how can I evaluate competition when I've got one machine. And so this is the way that we came up to try to do that. It was kind of an unconventional study. We had 8 pastures of yellow bluestem and Bermuda grass outside of Stillwater, Oklahoma, and you can see those 8 pastures laid out here. And basically they're long narrow strips, and they all came to a central point at the east end of this pasture. And that central point, that gathering area around the working corrals, is where we put the super smart feed, and that's the red box there. So we had these are warm season perennial grasses, and this study took place over 16 weeks during the summer. And the forage, I won't get into too much about forage stuff, but forage was abundant and was moderate to good quality. We put 16 steers in each pasture. So each one of these pastures had 16 steers in it, and the super smart feed was in that central location where all 8 of the pastures could have easy access to that feeder if we left the gates open for that pasture to get to the feeder. We did not leave the gates open all the time, but when they were open, the pastures had easy access. So this stocking rate, 16 steers, was well below our normal stocking rate, and like I said, the cattle had abundant forage throughout the summer, so that really wasn't a factor. We selected one pasture at random to be considered the tester pasture. In this case, it was pasture 6 for this year, and so the steers in pasture 6 were the tester pasture, and those were the steers that we focused on for measuring behavior. And that pasture had access to the super smart feed continuously for all 16 weeks, so they were always getting supplement from the super smart feed. The super smart feed was set to deliver 0.5 kilogram per steer per day for the whole study. So that was our limit. About these cattle got 0.5 kilogram per steer per day. The supplement we used was pelleted cottonseed meal and had momensin added. Okay, and so that's kind of some background stuff. We provided mineral, but then kind of the interesting part is how we achieved the competition. And so each week we opened gates to some of the other pastures besides the tester pasture, so that additional steers could also access the super smart feed. These additional steers provided competition to the steers from the tester pasture. So this structure is similar to a put and take grazing experiment, if you're familiar with those kind of experiments. I'm going to illustrate here in just a second kind of what that looks like, but one thing to understand is over the course of the 16 weeks, we were kind of altering how many cattle had access to the super smart feed. And so over those 16 weeks, we achieved a stocking density of the feeder of either 4 or 8 or 16 or 32 steers per feeding station. So some weeks only the tester pasture had access, so there were 4 steers per feeding station. And then some weeks all 8 pastures had access at the same time, and so there were 32 steers per feeding station that were competing for those feeding stations. We achieved each of those stocking densities 4 times each over the course of that 16 weeks, so we got some repeatability. We measured supplement intake and time spent near the feeder, and just focused on the cattle in that tester pasture so we could compare them week to week as the competition changed. So here's a kind of an illustration of how the stocking worked. In week 1, only the tester steers had access. And then in week 2, an additional pasture also got access. So in week 2, we had 2 pastures that had access to the feeder, and now we've got 8 cattle per feeding station that are competing. The steers from in this week, we took both pastures and mixed the steers together in one group, and then opened the gates to the pasture so that they could kind of come and go. They were one herd, and they came and went to the feeder as one group. Okay, and then at the end of the week, we sorted the cattle back to their pasture and kind of started the next access for the next week. So, like in this case, in week 3, there were 4 pastures that got access, and then in week 4, all 8 pastures would get access to the feeder, and we'd put all 8 pastures in one herd and rotate them through those pastures. So, trying to keep stocking density of the pasture pretty much even across these pastures, but vary the stocking density of the feeder. So that's kind of how that worked. We'd sort the cattle back in their home pastures and start over at the end of the weeks. And then the actual order of which paddocks got access to the feeder in which week was set up as a Williams crossover design. And this accounted for any potential carryover effects from previous week's competition. And so we designed it with that design to try to minimize any carryover effects from previous competition. When pastures didn't have access to the feeder, we fed them the same supplement at 0.5 kilogram per day in normal feed bunks at the front of the pastures, basically to keep the cattle interested and habituated to consuming supplements, so that when they did have access to the super smart feed, they'd want to use it. So we repeated this study for 2 years during the summers of 2018 and 2019. And the paper is currently in the 2nd round of review at the Journal of Applied Animal Science. So hopefully it'll be accepted soon and be published where you can access it there. One note I want to make: in the 2nd year, in 2019, we actually disabled one of the feeding trays of the Super Smart feed, so that there were only 3 trays available. And this effectively increased the competition, because we kept our cattle numbers the same in the 2nd year as they were in the 1st year, but we only had 3 trays instead of 4. So in the 2nd year, we had stocking densities for the feeder from about 5 cattle per feeding station to about 43 cattle per feeding station. So had more competition in the 2nd year to try to evaluate what that effect would be, kind of pushing it out there a little bit. So that's kind of our setup. The Super Smart feed recorded supplement intake each day for each animal, so that data was readily available from CLOC's website for analysis. We collared the steers in the tester pasture with homemade GPS trackers to document where the steers were spending time. And we measured, well, I guess Taylor really measured the forage mass and quality in each pasture each week. And we didn't want forage availability to influence our results. We had excellent weather the last 2 summers, and like I said, forage was abundant and good quality all summer. So don't feel like that forage limitations would be affecting these results. Okay, so let's. There's a lot of data we could look at here, but we could go ahead and jump into the results. And so this is the daily supplement intake of the tester steers in 2018. And as you can see, daily intake is quite variable. And so a lot of the days, cattle ate right at their limit of 0.5 kilogram per day. Often, you can see oftentimes some cattle didn't eat any supplement on a specific day. We had two of the tester cattle that did not use the feeder. And then we had one that didn't use the feeder for a period of time, and then partway through the summer started using the feeder, and then was fairly consistent. So I think that's the kind of variability that we see, and I think that's the kind of variability that's normal and that we should kind of expect when we start looking at individual animals on a daily basis in range conditions. So this is the same data from 2019, and so you can see there's maybe even more variability here that we saw this year. Several of the steers didn't start using the feeder until partway through the summer, and then several times steers stopped eating at a lower amount than what their actual limit was. So there's a little more variability in 2019. So this figure shows that at the high end of our designed stocking density, so the number of cattle that we put with the feeder, and this was for all the cattle in the trial, only about half of those cattle actually used the super smart feed on any given week. So basically what this means is that our actual stocking density was quite a bit less than what our designed stocking density was. And I think that's important to think about and understand. You know, I'm sure we can kind of get into a discussion of how to improve the utilization rate of the feeder with training or whatever like that. But we did a little bit of training, but not very much. But in this case, we had about half the cattle that used it and about half the cattle that didn't. So our actual stocking density was less than what our design was. So in the rest of these results, we're going to look at how the actual stocking density, the actual competition that we observed, how does that affect the variables that we were interested in. So the rest of the results are kind of scaled to the number of cattle that actually use the feeder in each week. Okay, so this is kind of the money slide, I guess, from this study. This is what we were trying to get to, and this is the mean supplement intake of all of the steers. Well, I guess actually I'm one ahead. This is the mean supplement intake of all the steers in the whole study. I'm going to get to the testers here in just a second. This is of all the steers in the whole study. So they were limited to about 1/2 kilogram per head per day. So the thing I wanted to show here is that it is difficult to get cattle, at least the cattle that we have, and in these kind of studies with stockers, it's difficult to get cattle to consume right up at the limit. And so cattle, it seems like they're always, if you average over a week or over a month or whatever, if you have a 1/2 kilogram limit per day, over a month, they're gonna average less than that, right? There'll be some days they don't eat that much, and a few days they don't eat anything at all. So that's something to factor into your expectations when using these kind of feeders. And that's what we've seen, certainly with stocker cattle and certainly cattle that have plenty of forage available. You change some of those variables about forage availability and type of cattle and all those kind of things, maybe that would change a little bit. Okay, and so then this is the slide that I think was real important. This is the supplement intake of the steers in the tester paddock. So these are just those 16 testers, and what you can see here is the regression here is slightly negative. So that means that competition did affect supplement intake negatively, and we actually expect that. We know that competition for a feeding space, we would totally expect that at some point that would have some effect on actual supplement intake. So when these steers had more competition for a feeding space, they consumed less supplement. It works out to about 4 grams of supplement per head per day less intake per steer of additional competition. Okay, so it's kind of maybe a hard way to think about that, but basically, one way to think about it is if you stocked one of these feeders at 20 steers per feeding station, those cattle would eat about 60 grams less per day than they would eat if you only had 5 steers per feeding station. So that's maybe a way to kind of scale what that regression slope feels like. So it's over that range from 5 to 20 steers per feeding station. It might be like a 60-gram difference in voluntary intake. So if your goal for supplement intake was 1/2 kilogram or 500 grams, then that would be, on the order of like a 10% reduction in voluntary supplement intake compared to that target. So that's kind of how that, how I think about it. I think this kind of information will be important for designing future research trials with this precision animal feeding research, and it's also of interest to potential commercial users of these types of automated feeders so that they understand what the effect of competition is. We know that logically there has to be some limit to the amount of competition. At some point, more competition would have to drastically reduce supplement intake and drastically change grazing behavior. But at least in our study, from where we measured it, from about 4 steers per feeding station up to about 25 or 26, somewhere in there, we saw a reduction in supplement intake, but it wasn't dramatic in the way that I think about it. It was relatively minor reduction in supplement intake. So this is a map showing location of the tester steers on a specific day in these pastures, and so this kind of gets to the grazing behavior thing. Overall, the steers spent about 4% of their day within 25 meters of the super smart feed. So 96% of the day they were away, what we call away from the super smart feed, and this was not really affected by competition. So it doesn't appear to me from this data yet that the level of competition that we implemented in this study was radically changing grazing behavior. The cattle were out in the pastures, and we assumed that they were grazing and behaving normally, but they spent about the same amount of time congregating around the feeder, regardless of the competition, and at least in the range that we implemented competition. So that was a good result that is good to understand. And then in 2019, we actually put pedometers on the tester steers to give us more information about their grazing behavior. And this was an interesting result, a little bit unexpected to me. When we put the pedometers on, it turns out that increased competition for a feeder space was associated with a relatively large increase in the number of steps the steers took per day. So I'm not really sure what implications this would have at the moment, but it's interesting to think about, and it may be something we want to investigate further and understand how this competition thing affects the behavior of cattle. So we did observe that in 2019. And so the take-home messages that I'd like to leave you with today is that we observed that as the number of cattle that are using an automated feeding station increases from about 4 to about 25, voluntary supplement intake goes down slightly. However, the amount of time that cattle spend near the feeder didn't change very much. We do think cattle, we did observe that they do seem to walk more, take more steps. And so I think that considering these results will be important for designing future experiments and for using these feeders in commercial applications. And I'd certainly like to highlight that in this, that the data that we showed here, I think is fairly specific to our scenario. I think there are a large number of variables that could affect this competition relationship. Forage type, pasture size, cattle type, forage availability, supplement type, amount. I think there's probably weather, there's probably other variables, a lot of other variables that are important that would factor into how competition would affect these animals. And I think we need to keep researching these variables and understand their effects so that we can use these new precision approaches to their maximum benefit, both for us as researchers and as commercial users. And so that was the information that I had for you today on the study that we did, and I'd be happy to answer any questions or hear feedback from you guys about the things that you're doing or things that you're interested in. So I think Mike maybe is going to moderate the questions for us. So.
All right, thanks for that, Ryan. We have about 7 or 8 questions here.
Okay.
The first question is, they're just asking acres per pasture.
Yeah, so we had about 20 acres per pasture. So not great big pastures, but they were almost half a mile long, and so that would be our stocking rate. Like I said, the 16 steers in a 20-acre pasture would be kind of a conservative stocking rate for us.
Okay, thanks for that. Next question is, what's the maximum kilograms you've tested feeding to an animal? Wondering if it's possible to feed an entire TMR through this unit.
So Mike and Scott could probably answer that question better than I could. I'm focused in my research solely in grazing animal nutrition, and I use this system strictly for supplementation. So I have not attempted to, and I'm going to let somebody else do the research feeding TMRs. So I don't know, Mike or Scott, what do you guys say about that?
Scott, you want to take that? You might be on mute, Scott.
He might be muted. Or he might have fell asleep too. So I don't see any technical reason that you couldn't feed a TMR and couldn't feed 20 pounds per animal per day through that system. I think it's capable of doing that from an engineering perspective. I think obviously that would dramatically affect this question of competition, right? If you're going to have cattle eating out of that thing and getting their entire feed for the day from it, they're going to have to stand there a lot longer to consume that. So
yeah, in just some back of the envelope calculations, we're figuring that if you're feeding full TMR, then it would probably be a lot fewer animals, probably in the ballpark of 20 to 30 animals. Really, it all depends on how many animals you have and how much throughout the day, how often they can spend there.
Yep. But I think it's capable. The machine, I believe, is capable to do that. I just haven't tried it. So.
Okay. Next question is: Did animals were adapted to the smart feeding system before the trial starts? Because if animals enter to have access to the system at different weeks, the experience among animals would be different and have an effect on the result. What do you think about it?
Yeah. So yeah, that's definitely a consideration in interpreting the data that we've got here in the way this was designed. We did put these cattle through a training and selection program right before we turned out and started this experiment. So basically, we used about 128 cattle in this experiment, and we selected those 128 from about 230 or so cattle that we had available. And for a couple of weeks before this experiment, we exposed those 230 cattle in groups of about 50 or 60. We exposed them to the super smart feed for a few days each, and tracked which of the animals used the super smart feed, and we basically kind of went at it like if they ate 1 kilogram of feed from the super smart feed for 2 days in a row, then we called those cattle, super smart feed users. And we went through all 230 cattle. They all had access to it. And then we selected the 128 from the group that we had identified as super smart feed users, and then allocated those randomly to those 8 pastures, and then randomly selected one of those pastures as the testers. So, we did what I would describe as kind of a minimal training or selection program to get this study started. That's kind of what we had to do for time crunch and logistics on our end. And I certainly think you could spend more time training and get the animals habituated to using the feeder better than what we did. But that's what we did in this study. And I definitely think that one of the limitations of the study approach that we used is that we didn't have cattle that had access to the super smart feed at different stocking densities of the feeder for a long period of time, like several months. And that kind of a study, I think, would provide some really good information as well if someone has the ability to do that, to have different competition levels for 2 or 3 months. Then you can kind of start taking out some of that. What's the effect of changing supplement access from the super smart feed to feeding in the trough and then going back the next week. And you could also measure the actual performance of the cattle, average daily gain of the cattle, and how does competition affect the average daily gain? And that's certainly a really important question. So the way we designed this study, we weren't able to measure those things, but those are certainly things we should measure and intend to try to do in the future.
Okay, thanks for that. We have a couple people that just wanted to thank you for the presentation.
Most welcome.
Somebody says, very interesting results. Do you think supplementation with the super smart feed may have affected grass intake in the paddocks? Please comment on this.
So I don't have any reason to think that feeding the supplement through the super smart feed would have any different nutritional effect than feeding the supplement in a trough, right? So I think the key thing that affects grass utilization and grass intake is how much of the supplement do cattle get, and what kind of supplement is it, those kind of things. And I think the delivery method, I don't think that would have much effect on the nutrition of the cattle. So we tried to measure the grazing time, and I think that would be the big effect is if cattle just stand at the feeder for 8 hours a day and don't go out and graze like they normally would. That would be something we'd certainly need to know about this delivery method. But I don't think the delivery method itself is going to have any effect on the nutrient utilization in the cattle. So.
Alrighty. Next question is, do you think that regulating the speed at which supplement is dropped may overcome the competition effect to some extent?
It's possible. I don't know the answer to that. It's possible. I think different cattle, just like different people, are going to eat supplement at different rates. And so if you've got cattle that consume supplement quickly, and you can feed them feed that individual at the rate that it will consume, at the maximum rate it'll consume, then basically you're for that animal, you're going to get its daily allotment fed quickly and get it out of the way. And so then another animal can come in and use that feeder. And if that animal's slower, then you would have to, I think you would have to dispense feed to basically match what the animal's rate of consumption is. But yeah, if you were to dispense feed slower than what some of the animals could consume potentially, then you would kind of slow down the whole process. So I think varying the rate of dispense is an approach to try to minimize the competition and minimize the amount of time that animals have to spend standing at that feeder. So.
All right. We have somebody asking, did you see that steers had a favorite bunk space?
Yeah, no, we didn't. So I've that's kind of been folklore to me for a long time. I mostly hear about it in dairies, I guess. That cattle like to go back to their specific feeding station, their feeding location, and I think that's at least I've always heard that. But when I look at how these cattle use these different precision feeders and feeding stations, we've actually done a study at our feed yard with a colleague, Blake Wilson, who we measured that preference for a specific feed bunk at our feed yard, and I haven't ever observed a statistically significant preference for a specific feed bunk by a population of animals. So I didn't observe that in this study, and so I've always heard that as in the industry, but every time I look for it, I can't find it. So that's where I'm at on that. So.
Okay, thanks for that. And there's been about 30 or 35 questions that have come in just over the past few minutes. So we probably won't be able to get to all of them during this webinar, but we will answer all of them. We have everybody's email that's on this. So
cool. Pick your favorite 4 or
5. There's a lot of good ones though, is the problem. Have you compared the daily animal intake consistencies between the Super Smart Feed and the Smart Feed Pro system?
No, nope. That'd be an interesting thing to do, but I have not done that yet.
Okay, let's see here. Did the animals have access to all bunks, or were they separated according to their weights, so that the heavy ones competed with the heaviest and the lightest competed with the lightest?
No, it was kind of an open free for all. So all of the cattle, all 100, went on those weeks that we had all of the pastures that had access. It was all 128 cattle had access to the Super Smart Feed with no other restrictions. So these were stockers that were sale barn origin stockers, and we kind of sorted them a little bit when we turned them out. So they were all, probably the maximum weight range was maybe 200 pounds, something like that, from the lightest to the heaviest. So they weren't dramatically different in body size, but we didn't do anything about trying to group the cattle by body size and competition that way. So it might be something worth doing, but we didn't do
it. Okay. Next question, and they apologize, maybe I missed it, but how many times a day did steers visit the Super Smart Feed?
So I don't have that off the top of my head, the number of times they visited. I'd have to go back in the data and look at that. I don't remember. One thing I do remember from that data is that we basically had visitation to the super smart feed at every hour of the day at some point, but excuse me. We had visitation every hour, but there were certainly peaks at like 7 o'clock in the morning and 5 o'clock in the afternoon. You can, if you kind of did a histogram, you would see, you know, peaks at those times of day, kind of probably as you would expect for those times of day. We would go in and when we hand fed the pastures that didn't have access to the super smart feed, we'd do that, you know, kind of first thing in the morning. And so, you know, perhaps our management behavior affected when the cattle came and ate supplement from the super smart feed, but we didn't know how to manage to take that factor out logistically, but that's what we observed. So.
I'm sorry, I was on mute this whole time. The next question is, was water location the same for all pastures, and where was water located relative to the feeder?
Yeah, so I think I could go back to that slide. Pardon the scrolling through here. So in this basically this map right here, the blue dots by the super smart feed are the water tanks. So there are big rubber tower water tanks that were split. So there was 2 pastures that shared a water tank, and those tanks were kind of laid out how you see them there, you know, at the east end of those pastures near where we had the common area where the super smart feed was. There were ponds in like 7 of these pastures had ponds in them, but we fenced the ponds out, so the cattle, we tried to exclude the pond water, so that basically cattle are coming to the front of the pastures to get water, and that's where they all had water access right there. So good question.
Okay, I think we still have something like 20 questions, but we'll have to address those all offline. Final question is, did you evaluate rumination behavior and line time and the impact of competition?
We didn't evaluate rumination. We didn't measure that. I think we did have. I think we did collect the data on lying bouts from those pedometers, and it wasn't a significant effect, and so I didn't present that here. But I think we did collect that data. But we didn't do anything with rumination.
Okay. Sorry, my computer is acting up here.
Yeah.
Kurt wanted to say some things before we ended this, but I'm not actually. Oh, here we go. Kurt, are you on the line?
I am. Thanks, Ryan, a lot for presenting. Can you hear me?
Bet. Yep.
Thanks a lot for presenting today. We really appreciate it. We'll get the questions answered that have come in. And if anybody on the webinar would like more information, please feel free to email contact@c-lockinc.com, and we'll get you routed to the right person to answer the questions or to provide any additional information. So we really appreciate it, Ryan, and it's good to see your face.
Yeah, you bet. All right.
Thank you very much.
Sure enjoyed it. Appreciate everybody hanging with me, and it was fun. We'll do it again sometime.
Hope so. Thanks, everybody, for attending.
Thanks, Ryan.
Thanks. Adios.